Was made famous in the book Two Girls, Two Catamarans. This man basically invented the multi-hull sailing movement that we see today. And this is a sailing story you don't want to miss. He and his two girlfriends, at the same time, were cruising all over the world, mostly naked, on a boat that he built himself. And it really pissed off the sailing establishment at the time. Since I started this series on everything you need to know about specific boats and brands, people have been asking me to do a piece on Wharram catamarans. And as I dug more into the research for this episode, I realized the story isn't about boats, it's about James Wharram, the man who started it all. This week on Everything You Need to Know, we're talking about Wharram, the boat and the man. This place is a mess right now, because life is crazy right now, so bear with me. Also, this is the first episode in years that I'm editing on Windows instead of Mac, so let me know if you can tell. Okay, so a man with two girlfriends, mostly naked, sailing the tropics on a homemade catamaran. It sounds interesting to say the least, but the story is even more amazing than it sounds. And all that said and done, you can actually get one of his boats right now. Okay, so our story really starts hundreds of years ago with Polynesian sailors. They had a unique way of traveling, starting with their boats. For shorter trips at the time, it was pretty common to use a canoe, a very long double-ended hull that was paddled or even sometimes sailed. To make the amazing journeys the Polynesians eventually embarked on, they took two canoes, built some crossbeams, and lashed them together with some rope. They added a mast and a sail, and you were ready to go just about anywhere, and actually quite quickly. They sailed fast. The design was honed, and eventually cabins were added to each hull for living quarters. And these guys, the Polynesians, made it everywhere. They crossed oceans. They went to New Zealand. They went to Hawaii. And their method for navigation as they traveled tens of thousands of nautical miles across oceans, the stars. That's it. The stars. Two canoes lashed together, some rope, and the stars. And we bicker today about what makes a blue water boat. So now enter James Wharram. It's England. It's right after World War II. James Wharram is a young man, and he's studying to become a building engineer, following in his father's footsteps. And if there's anything England needed a lot after this horrible war, it was people to help them rebuild. James was smart, he was ambitious, and he came across a book written by Eric de Bishop about building double-ended canoe-based boats on ancient Polynesian engineering and then sailing them around the world. James was fascinated and he wanted to try it. He wanted to build one at least. The problem at the time was James lived with his parents, about 200 miles from any body of water, but caution to the wind, he went for it. He started building a boat in his parents' backyard. His dad was pretty pissed. The boat he built was called Tangaroa. It was 23 feet long. It was two canoes lashed together. His first boat, and untested, he convinced some of his friends to help him drive the hulls the 200 miles out to the sea, partly to see if they floated and actually worked, and partly to go pick up his girlfriends. Both of them. James was an interesting guy, obviously, but it's important to understand that he lived in England where, at the time, the sailing establishment was for the gentlemen, men of honor and military awards, a proud naval tradition. To be respected by this community was hard. You had to have money and accomplishments, of which James had neither. This longing to be accepted by the proper British sailing world does come into play later in the story. But let's get back to James and his two girlfriends, shall we? So James and his buddies, they get the hulls to the east coast of England and they lash them together. The hulls are small, they're low. They each have their own little interior cabin, albeit both very small. The two masts are erected and the thing floats. Part of the Polynesian design concept that James followed is that everything is lashed together with rope, not permanently fixed or fastened. Two hulls that can flex and move independently of each other. I mean, ever so slightly, but they do move independently. A design that he would actually stick with for Wharram catamarans for decades. So, James hops on the boat and heads for Germany. Right, Did I mention his two girlfriends are both German? Right after World War II, an Englishman. James is not only dating a German girl, but two German girls. I wonder why the snooty British sailors wouldn't talk to him. Lady K Sailing is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to keep this channel improving. Big shout out this week to our newest patrons, Josh and Richard. Welcome to the team, guys. Thank you. So James sets sail for Germany to pick up his girlfriends, Jutta and Ruth. The two ladies hop on board and the trio set sail. James wanted to prove that these Polynesian-designed boats from centuries earlier were fully capable of crossing the Atlantic, which is a fairly hefty goal on a homemade 23-foot boat. So they set sail from Germany and they head for Trinidad, and everything was okay at first. When the bad weather hit, they started to have trouble with the steering. The rudders kept trying to fall off. The rudders were held on by long metal pins that kept breaking, and they didn't really work right, so James would replace the pins with the replacements that he brought. But eventually, he set out to blacksmith some new pins using nails and a hammer and a paraffin stove. So they find themselves in the Caribbean now, and Jutta, one of his girlfriends, is pregnant by this point, which is rubbing people the wrong way still, even in the Caribbean. And they set out to build a second boat, make some improvements based on their experience in their 23-footer. So two canoes strapped together again, they go for Boat 2.0. Gone were the flat hulls in favor of a V-shaped design. And with a baby on the way, gone was the 23-foot design in favor of 38 feet. The resulting boat they built was named Rongo, and the unconventional little family set sail again to rub more people the wrong way in different countries. Most of the travel at sea featured a little bit of nudity here and there because that's how they did things. So the girls would be up on deck trimming sails naked, as you do. Jutta was the artist, though. James would visualize a design for a boat, and Jutta, being her artist self, would beautifully draw it, put, pen to paper and draw his design out so that they could then start building it. So on their Boat 2.0, they island hopped the Caribbean on Rongo, and eventually they made it to the east coast of America, successfully traversing the Atlantic from Europe to North America. They did what you do, and they bombed up the east coast and finally found themselves in Brooklyn, because after traveling half the planet on a homemade boat, what else would you do? You go to Brooklyn. James actually remarks that he found the American sailing community to be much more open to his multi-hull approach to sailing and his lifestyle choices. The Americans weren't as snooty and stuck up about the whole thing, but he still yearned for acceptance from his British homeland. There was really only one thing he could do to impress the Brits. He could make the first ever Atlantic crossing in a multi-hull. At that point, it had never been done. Inspired, he got Rongo ready for the journey, and he set out to cross the ocean, planning on landing in Ireland. Along the crossing of the Atlantic, he did run into trouble. There's a lot of weather out there. It does get scary. So the rudder pins on Rongo, the same as Boat 1.0, the rudder pins on Rongo snapped again, and they almost lost one of the rudders. So James took one of the rudders off and actually sawed it in half. The weight reduction solved the actual problem, and it made no performance impact at all, so he learned a lot. Thus far, James was funding his adventure by writing a few articles for sailing magazines and making appearances in different talks when he was invited to do that. But having built two different boats and sailed them tens of thousands of miles, he came up with a third design in his head, and it would be his first commercial success. This third design was Tangaroa, a 34-foot, again, twin hulls lashed together with rope. Everything he had learned went into this one, and while he was not a boat manufacturer, he did sell the plans for the boat that people could buy. And people did. Almost 500 of them. James would go on to design and build many more boats, including his flagship, a 63-footer, based on the same concept. Usually the cabins were in each hull, but some of the more robust designs started to put what he called deck pods in the middle on the part that connects the two hulls. That's what we see in today's catamarans as the space containing the galley, the living area, and the cockpit. Gone today are James's days of multiple partners, and now his wife of some 50 years, Haneke, helps him design boats. And she draws them. James carried the same tradition in Polynesian design through the 70s, 15 different plans at that point, ranging from 16 feet all the way to 51. Those are some plans you can still buy today and build them yourself. In the 80s, he turned to adding more interior space and headroom because that's what was going on in the 80s. Sailboats were getting bigger inside. And those designs were 14 feet to 46 feet. The concept of the Wharram design business or the Wharram boat business is that he uses everything he knows and his flair for bucking against the tide of convention to come up with some great ideas for multi-hull cruising boats. People at home buy the plans and they build the boats themselves. He doesn't have to build them. And as part of that design philosophy, James set out to make his plans really easy to build so anybody could do it. If you want to be a naked sailor with 2 German girlfriends, all you need is a modest budget, basic wood and glass skills, and a big sense of adventure. People are still building these things today. Usually in the series, at this point in the video, we talk about quality, seaworthiness, reliability, but we can't really measure these boats by those same standards because everybody builds their own Wharram. So if you're looking at a Wharram, it really depends on who built it. But what we can talk about in this video is design. There is a big part of these boats that's different from a conventional cat, and that's that they're flexible. They're meant to flex. The hulls and almost everything on the boat is joined with lashing. Originally rope, but now it's Dyneema. But nonetheless, they're not meant to be rigid. They're meant to move a little bit. Almost everything on the boat's lashed together in such a very secure way, but it's a whole different concept. And it's also intended to be lived in the 2 different hulls, whereas a modern cat is meant to be lived in sort of in the middle bit. So the 2 different hull approach, it's good for privacy, but I mean, if you're going to be sailing around naked, who really cares about privacy? Now, as these boats are known to be home built by, the end user, that's not to say that you can't get a factory-built Wharram. The company is still in business. They still sell the plans. They still do their thing. And now they have what's called franchise builders. So builders that they authorize to professionally build these boats. So if you want a professionally built Wharram, that's an option. So how do we close this one out? James Wharram, amazing man, inspiring adventurer. Sounds like he had a pretty amazing life. And I love the anarchy of it all. Naked sail trimmers, build your own boat, screw the Brits, I'm crossing the ocean. You just can't ignore what this guy did for the sailing community, and a lot of it led to the lagoons and stuff that we have today, the big catamarans. He made catamarans popular. So do you want to go cruising on a Wharram? Well, you either build it yourself, and I'm actually really falling in love with that idea, or you buy one someone else built 10, 15, 20 years ago. I'm not so much into that idea unless it's very well proven, if they've circumnavigated in it and I can inspect it extremely thoroughly. I really like the idea of building my own Wharram. The whole boat being lashed together kind of scares me a little bit, I will admit, and it probably scares you too. But it's known as the 4x4 of the seas, and it is proven. The slight, tiny little bit of flexibility from my research is meant to be. It's better for the seas. The boat sort of twists and moves around a little bit. I mean, not to the point where you're going to fall down or you even notice it, but everything moves independently because it's lashed together, and it makes the boat more resilient and more capable and longer lasting, as weird as that sounds. I think that this is an amazing story about an amazing boat, an amazing man, and to be honest, after doing the research and everything I did for this piece, I do kind of want one now. So we're going to end this here. You'll have to excuse me. I'm actually going to go price out some Wharram designs. I'll see you guys next week. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more sailing stories. Bye.